I hope that your evening went well. Does anyone have any questions about what we covered yesterday? Now that you've had a chance to let it sink in and think about it.
I'm sure I have questions, but I don't have them right now because I need to review the recorded session.
Right.
I think we'll be gathered trying to understand how you kind of like created the official flow, or more realistic flow versus how everything started down with what we have in our study guides. Kind of around. I think once I go over it again, I'll be able to better formulate some questions to understand why you took the approach that you took. That's going to be very helpful to me.
So, are you talking about the technique slide?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, the technique slide, it's just, I think the difference is between your study guide. What is it covered? Is it covered in alphabetical order?
Well, most of the, so not just that guide, but, even if you go to your knowledge base and you start stepping through how it has it formulated. Well, what you did yesterday is you just went all around and you said it was a more realistic approach to business. So that's what I really want to get under my butt. I know I'm going to have some questions, but I just can't put them together yet until I fully understand your pattern.
Okay, so are you talking about the order of the slide decks, or?
So, when we started dealing with, planning, monitoring, elicitation, collaboration, you were skipping around through the knowledge areas. It wasn't like one after the next, how it has it down, charted for us. You kind of skipped around and made complete sense, but I just need to get a better grip. So I think I'm just talking about the knowledge area section.
Okay, so are you referring to, just so that I can be clear, are you referring to this slide deck?
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, but we had the one up yesterday that was colored.
Okay, so that's the techniques.
Techniques, okay.
Right, and the techniques are not, so I think the confusion there, or the challenge there, might be that, let me make sure I've got the right slide deck that you're thinking about. This one?
Exactly.
Okay, yeah, this is techniques. And one of the things I was wanting you guys to be very careful about is these, these are not just in planning. Like functional decomposition is in planning. It's also in strategy analysis, I believe. It's in, so if you go look at your Babok, that's what I was trying to help you guys understand. Don't memorize this slide. This is only to kind of give you an idea, because these techniques, for example, what was I showing you? Functional decomp?
Yeah.
Okay, it's not going to tell you there. But if I go to the very top. It doesn't like that, does it?
You spelled functional wrong.
Oh.
You should spell ID.
You've had more coffee than me. All right. So it's in the business analysis, planning, and monitoring section. Okay, which is where you just saw it. It is also in requirements lifecycle management under trace requirements. And in prioritize requirements. And it's in analyze current state of strategy analysis and future state. It's in define change strategy. Do you see what so that's why I was taking you through the natural flow of something. And I was also trying, and maybe I didn't do this very well, I was trying to, where'd my stuff go? There we go. I was trying to express to you guys the importance of understanding that, sorry, my coffee's still trying to work and I'm trying to do multiple things while I'm talking to you. I was trying to impress upon you guys the importance of the fact that those things are everywhere in the BABOK. And
right.
So I was just trying to take you through talking about them in a natural flow of what you would normally experience. But again, business analysis, and this is what gets really, really, this is the most challenging part of what we do and studying. And that is that it'd be really nice if there was a true structured flow to what we do.
Right.
That would make it a lot easier to study. It would make it a lot easier for us to do what we do sometimes, but there is no real structure, because every time you learn something new, I mean, everything's up for grabs. So, I think that you're going to be better served by, like you said, going back through and listening to the natural flow of me talking about how do I normally run into these techniques? What would a typical flow be for me to usually leverage those techniques. And I think one of the things you'll notice is I had to go back through and say, okay, so what did I miss? Because there are 50 techniques, and there's so many different kinds of change that I could be engaged in that I could wind up using most of the techniques, a few of the techniques. It's just not, it's not cut and dry. It's not hard. It's not that easy to just explain, because it's honestly not that easy to execute, which is why there's a certification and why people that can do what you guys can do are special, more special than the people you work for typically realize. So.
Well, I think I'll get a better grasp of it once I have something to apply it to. Right now it's just storing knowledge. And so the way that you're training is going to help me to apply it to something much more realistic. So, I mean, this is fantastic.
Hopefully.
I know I'll have questions after I gather some more.
Yeah, there are going to be some ways in which I will likely fail you, but my approach is typically to apply it to real world with stories, so that, because when we make stories, we start painting pictures in our head, and when we do that, we typically remember.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
thank you.
Hopefully that will help you overcome the sheer breadth and depth of what you have to understand in order to go through the certification. Now, I will tell you, I know that sounds scary, and I know this is a lot of information, and the ECBA is, the majority of the ECBA is about theory and knowledge. It's not about capability of application. So those of you that are doing ECBA, and I'm getting a couple of questions, is that the ECBA, if you go through and you understand the 50 techniques, what their purpose is and what the strengths and limitations are, you're going to have what you need for your test. Because if you understand the purpose, not necessarily can you apply it, can you read it, can you interpret it, you don't have to know that. But if you understand the purpose of that technique and what its strengths and limitations are, when you get a question about which of the following techniques would be leveraged in the confirm elicitation results task in elicitation and collaboration, and you'll be able, and it'll give you a list of 4 techniques, and 3 of them will usually be pretty clear that based on your understanding of their purpose and strengths and limitations, you wouldn't use that to talk to people or get people to work together, so you'll if you do that, you'll be okay. Now, for your real world, so focus on that for now. Don't try to understand the details or the depth of some of what I share, because I'm having to appeal to all 3 levels of certification, right?
Sure.
So keep that in mind. You're going to be best served by using your flashcards, memorizing those. If you memorize your task input-output diagrams, that'll help a lot. And then if you know your terminology, and if you know the techniques and their purpose, like I said, their purpose, strengths, and limitations, you should be well set for your test on ECBA level. CCBA is not so much. You will need to kind of be able to think through the application and when certain types of techniques would be more appropriate than others based on parameters provided. So those CCBA and CBAP, you do have a more difficult lift in understanding these things. And I just got another question about, can I share some best practices since there's no real structure to business analysis? So that's something that there's so much to consider there that it's really difficult for me to just give you an elevator speech about it. What you will pick up throughout training is you will pick up some conversation that will help you understand that. So as I'm teaching things about business analysis, planning, and monitoring, I'll throw in my stories that help you understand how I have been most successful leveraging those things. While that's not as important for your exam, it's going to be helpful for you cementing the information in a relatable way so that you can have a little bit of a leg up on your exam. So best practices, since there's no real structure, I do have a few things that I will say about that that aren't specific to these slide decks, but it's not prevalent in the world right now, and that is the best practices for leveraging a business analyst is to allow them to live in the middle. Don't silo them into IT, or don't silo them into the business, and definitely don't silo them into a single solution or function of an organization, because that builds assumptions and biases in that analyst. It's a great place to start. It's that kind of application of the BA skill set and individual is a safe place to start when they're fairly young in their BA career, because they have to, you have to give them a smaller world to adjust to before you open up those doors and unleash that. Best practices on timing of engaging. Ideally, a business analyst gets involved all the way up front. And if we can't get all the way up front, because we're younger and we don't have the experience necessary for strategy, we need to have access to the understanding of how we came to the point that we're at in order to effectively define requirements going forward. I have found it best to slow down a little bit to speed up. Most organizations don't like that today. We are very much, in the majority of the world, not everywhere, but in the majority of the world, we are an impatient, get there yesterday, I can just throw it away tomorrow society. We are very instant gratification, so we don't like waiting. Yes, the concepts of business analysis. For now, you will want to focus on, again, like I said, ECBA, it's a lot of memorization. CCBA, CBAP, don't, every situation is going to present to you a possible different way and different order of executing these knowledge areas and their tasks and applying the techniques. So it's about understanding the criticality, complexity, and personalities involved in the change and planning around that. And that's what we're about to talk about. So we will be covering these in the order that they're in the BABOK. If you have straightforward change, it typically flows in a very similar order, right? Usually you've talked to someone, so usually you have an elicitation piece, but it's just really informal. So you would probably say, don't count that informal conversation and say, okay, you've gotten your first little conversation that's kicked you off and you're off and running. You're going to start with planning. Even if it's just a few minutes in your head where you try to wrap your mind around what this person's asking you to do, and then you start planning and you start thinking about who do I need to talk to, and you might just naturally, because you've been in that organization a while, know what kind of elicitation techniques that person will respond to well, right? Or maybe you have to research that person a little bit to know how to approach them with elicitation, but that's planning and monitoring. Most of the things that we do can take anywhere from 5 minutes to months or years. It just really depends on the situation we're trying to address. So with that being said, do you guys have any other questions about content yesterday before I jump into planning and monitoring? Okay, so let's get going. We have a bit of stuff to cover. So this is a story that I'm not intimately familiar with. So I typically use my own stories. What I can say about these two slides is that often what happens if we don't do planning and monitoring, then we will miss a lot of information, right? So if we don't stop and think about what we're doing, we can often miss things that we should have considered. So if we're talking about, let's say that we're talking about managing, let's see, I'm looking at this slide. I don't know the story behind it. If I'm looking at this slide and I think about my history, I worked at a retail oil and gas organization, and they did merchandising and marketing stuff at the store level all the time. And so maybe they're trying to understand how well they implemented a new method by which they manage their merchandising in the store, right? And they want to understand, and they were hoping to increase net profit by placing things in a specific order and doing sales in a specific way. And so they implemented all that change, and then they're like, well, how do we know how well we did? And then people are thinking, I don't know, we didn't even think about reports, right? It's about stop for a minute. Also, there can be legal things that need to be considered, and it's easy to forget organizations in your enterprise like legal or security or areas like that, right? The areas that are a lot more about the non-functional requirements, because we're very, very good about reacting to the primary pain brought forth, and that's usually functional because a person is hurting. I mean, sometimes you'll have a project that gets kicked off because we realize that we have a security breach or a legal issue, but usually it's more about the people trying to keep the business running and what they need. And when we don't stop for a minute and think big picture and plan it out, then we miss stuff. And so it's easy for us to not think about all of the different user types that we need to engage, or all the different stakeholder groups that we need to engage, if we don't look at that big picture and stop and do a little bit of planning. So, I mean, it's a common saying out there. There are some situations where you're going to have to respond. You're just going to have to react, and that's the nature of the beast. But we usually have the opportunity to slow down for a minute so we can speed up effectively later. But a lot of the times people are in a hurry and they have this pain right now. They're not thinking about the pain that would happen later. So they're very much about what they can see right now. And the purpose of this knowledge area is to do that stop a minute, wait a minute, let's think about this, be organized, try to coordinate your efforts for what you're trying to accomplish, because this is hard enough as it is for us to be able to function well in our in change. Change is chaotic, change is unpredictable, and so if we don't stop for a minute and think about it, then we could have some challenges. This knowledge area has 5 tasks, and not like super exciting on the content, but it is like an evil necessity, right? A necessary evil that we do. At least that's the way I see it. I'd rather get in with people and design solutions. I just don't have a lot of patience for this, but I'm aware of the value that it can bring, because I've experienced pain enough when I don't do it. So we're going to talk about these 5 tasks. Some of the things that I want you to think about, we're going to talk about approach. Now, what that means is, how am I going to address this? What is my approach to this situation? We're going to be talking about performance assessments. That is probably exactly what you have in your head about it. And then we're going to talk about policies. And these are statements of intent on how we are expected to behave. They are often translated directly into the rules by which we do business. We're going to talk about change strategy. Now, that is an actual strategy analysis task. But when we are planning, we in the early part of our planning and monitoring, we don't have this change strategy. But if we're in that iterative change after we've defined what the solution is going to look like, now we can actually start executing that change strategy, and we use that to plan our next phase and the next phase and the next phase, so on and so forth. We're going to be talking about current state and performance standards. Organizational performance standards, those are your KPIs in your organization and how you are measured by the organization or enterprise. So any questions before I jump into the actual content of this knowledge area, the tasks themselves? Okay. One of the things I hope you've noticed is you don't have to say, I'm good or anything like that. I will usually wait about 5 to 7 seconds, and if no one speaks up, I move on. Okay, so I like covering those later. Sorry, I'm gonna skip to this one. Okay, so we're gonna talk about the approach, planning our approach. Approach was the very first term that was mentioned that you will see here. So BA planning and monitoring, plan the BA approach. So an approach, we already mentioned what an approach is, right? We talked about it's a way of planning something or executing something, right? So can you think there are 2 very common approaches for business analysis? Can you tell me what those are? One of them starts with an A.
Agile and waterfall.
There you go. Agile and waterfall are the 2 most common approaches. And that's that's the terminology that you're very familiar with. We're going to convert that terminology into BABOK terminology. So BABOK calls those very different things. So when we don't stop and plan, right? This is what we want, right? There's going to be tension in a project. We're going to have tension. If we think about what we need to do, we're going to have some tension while we're executing and stuff, but then the tension is going to go down because the things that we planned out, if we stop for a minute now, yes, we will experience tension. People will be frustrated. They will feel like it's slowing down. But as the further you go in a project, you're going to hit a spot. And if you don't do planning and monitoring well, if you don't stop for a minute and think about what we're doing, what's going to happen is some point in the project, the majority of the time, not every time, but often, you'll hit something. You'll hit something that had you stopped for a minute earlier on and thought bigger picture, you would have realized could be a challenge and you would have planned for it. But if you don't think like that and you just go execute without any strategy, without really thinking about it, and without planning effectively, you could hit a spot in your project that can completely undo your momentum. Because now that thing that you learned that you could have identified earlier on is causing you to have to stop and undo progress so that you can address that discrepancy or that area that the solution would be lacking and address it. And now you have a huge problem because you've got hundreds of change requests because we didn't really engage all the right people. We didn't ask all the right questions. We just hurried up to get it out there because that's what people seem to want us to do, right? So stopping for a minute and planning it out and doing strategy analysis and doing requirements the right way doesn't have to take a long time, but it can save us a lot of time later, right? So that's what we want to avoid. And it usually happens when you don't stop and plan. That problem often happens within close proximity to go live date. And now you've got all kinds of challenges in your hands. So what is an approach? An approach is, especially if we plan it out, gives us a path to getting to where we're trying to go. It's a way of us saying, okay, this is where we're trying to get to, and what is the best approach for getting us there for this challenge. Now, in the software world, actually, I need you to cross that out. Okay. There are two common approaches, predictive and adaptive. Try to get waterfall and agile out of your thought process. That is not in your exam. It's predictive and adaptive according to the BAPM. And it's not just the software world. It's in general. Change has two common approaches. You can do predictive or adaptive change regardless of whether software is at play or not. So thinking about an approach, we have predictive and adaptive. And we'll talk about a little bit more about what that means. So a large waterfall project, which is what the BAPM refers to this as predictive. We are often dealing with, by the time, well, I mean, I think it depends on how large the change is that we're addressing, right? But when we're doing when we're doing a very large change in an organization and we try to do it predictively, then we have a lot to uncover and it's going to take a while, right? So if it takes very long, by the time we get to the point where we're ready to implement, so many things could have changed. This world that we're in changes quickly. So trying to do all upfront definition and get everything right is very, very difficult in today's world, usually, because things change too fast. And if we think that we're going to get every requirement right, we are delusional. Because, I mean, I'd like to think I'm pretty good at what I do. I miss stuff all the time. So it's, that thing that we talked about called analysis paralysis. Waterfall can very, very easily fall into analysis paralysis if you're not careful. So predictive, try to change waterfall to predictive in your mind. I just failed to do so. Predictive is where we define everything all up front. But in today's world, things change so fast, and the adoption of technology change has sped up so much that if we try to get everything right up front, we're going to be missing the boat. So it's very, very important that we behave, we need to adapt to new understanding, and we need to be okay with non-perfection. So if we look at these two different approaches, this on the left is predictive, where I do all of my requirements up front, and then I design my solution, and then I build the solution, and then I test the solution, and then I repeat it, and then I repeat it. But it's, I just focus, I get all of them up front. And then after it's in production, now what I wind up doing is addressing the deficiencies, and I create a new project. But it's not about being adaptive and change and planning the implementation of capability out over time. I'm trying to get everything up front, and oops, I got it wrong. Let me fix it. That's predictive. Adaptive is where I do these changes in cycles, and I do only as much change as necessary for someone to be able to leverage it, so that I can learn from that while I'm already so adaptive is where I do the strategy for the long-term view and the long-term picture. The expectation is that I do strategy analysis. Strategy analysis is not sped up for adaptive. It's strategy analysis is what it is. But the the implementation of requirements, design, construction, and testing is where you take those results of that strategy and you take that backlog of higher level requirements and you break that down and you only do a few of them. Now, a few business requirements will often explode out into multiple other requirements, whether you're going this route of stakeholder, functional, non-functional, or user story with acceptance and evaluation criteria, because they're the same thing. We're just formatting them differently and calling them a different thing, but it's the same thing. So with adaptive, which is off to the right, I'm still doing the same cycle. I'm just doing it with smaller amounts of focused priorities, and I'm working on this one. And then when it finishes testing and it goes into a productive environment, while we're learning from what we put out there, I'm already on to the next cycle. And then by the time I hit this cycle, I'm probably fixing things from this cycle, right? So on and so forth. So predictive assumes I get all of it all up front. On adaptive, I do my strategy up front, but then my iterative implementation of value occurs over time in smaller chunks while I learn from it and adjust. So I don't have to get through a whole year of effort before I start finding things that we could do better or learning from those things so that we can do a slightly different, we can do adjustments to our solution. So the purpose of this task is to say, okay, what is the method by which I'm going to do what I do? What kind of tasks am I going to be managing? When is it going to happen? Who is going to be involved and what are their responsibilities? What techniques am I going to employ? And what deliverables am I going to provide? So that's the purpose of Plan BA approach. I'm trying to figure out, okay, with this specific challenge, it's a regulated issue. So I'm going to have to go waterfall on this one because highly regulated stuff, that can get questionable if you are trying to implement change for regulated environments. You can't get that wrong because that can hurt, right? So I'm going to know, my tasks I'm going to plan out all my tasks. I'm going to do all of this all up front, and I'm going to plan it based on a waterfall, based on a predictive approach. If I have the ability to be adaptive, I'm going to figure out what does that look like? What does the strategy analysis look like? What is my elicitation and collaboration for detail when it comes to later in the project? And I plan that stuff out up front. Not in too terrible detail. If I'm doing this, planning my activities, if I know I'm going to do predictive, I will plan everything up front. If I know I'm going to do adaptive, I'm going to have an idea about a long-term roadmap of what I'm going to try to accomplish, but my details on task schedule timing, just like you do with an agile world, for those of you that are familiar with that, I'll get only the details for what's coming soon, right? So how am I going to go about doing that? That's the purpose of this, is to figure out how I'm going to approach it, what are the things I'm going to do, and who do I need to engage. So your organization, you may not have a choice. Your organization may say, we're an agile shop, right? Okay, great. Well, if we're an agile shop, what methodology of agile do we follow? Because there are multiple ones. Maybe your organization, maybe you work for an insurance company and they're like, we're not flying by the seat of our pants on anything here. We are regulated. We're going to dot our I's and cross our T's. Okay, so your organization can define that. Or maybe you work for an organization that trusts you as a business analyst and lets you figure out the right approach based on the type of change that you're working on, the criticality of it, and the complexity of it, right? So in my world, even I've gone into shops that I go into them and they are a self-proclaimed agile shop. And And they're doing most of what you would expect in an agile world, but they're not doing requirements well in that agile process. And so I wind up doing my own thing, even though the organizational standard says one thing, and I'm telling them that's not what this project needs. That's not what this challenge requires. I got to do some use cases or we're going to have problems later. And so they let me do what I need to do. So I have often been lucky enough where I can tell them, we don't have time to wait. We need to be really agile with this, guys. Or, you know what, we got to think about this better and we got to do some more detailed documentation, or we're going to have problems with we're going to have a bad situation later. So it's one of those things where you might define it because of the challenge that you're dealing with, or your organization might have a preset expectation for the methodology that they use. If the world you're in is a heavy project shop, right? They're all about PMI. Then they're going to consider your business analysis approach as part of a project. In an ideal world, the BA function starts before a project has been solidified or planned. So it's not a project approach, it's a change approach. But often you will find that you are living in this right here, where you are a project manager is assigned first, and then you're assigned to them as a business analyst to work on the project, which introduces some challenges. But that is what the world is right now. So when I'm thinking about my business analysis approach, ideally it is structured, it's selected based on the change we're working with, right? What are the goals of this change? And if this change is about protecting us from some risk, and it's a regulated risk, I should be doing a more waterfall approach, right? I should be thinking it out, planning it out carefully. It's regulated. It could hurt us if we get it wrong. If it's something where we're trying to respond to customers' needs and they're going to leave us soon if we don't take care of it, well, that's going to be a more adaptive approach to that change. So I'm going to try to figure out, based on what we're trying to accomplish and the challenge that we're dealing with in the business, should I do predictive or adaptive? And once I figure that out, I need to make sure that my approach is taken into consideration with all of the activities of the project. Or the change, with the activities associated with change. So I want to make sure that based on the kind of change that we're dealing with, if there are going to be other people involved, right? And so I want to make sure that whatever activities I'm doing are coordinated with other activities that are involved in this change. And when I'm thinking about that, I want to manage the risk, just like a project manager does. The business analysis, planning, and monitoring honestly feels a lot like something you would find in project management. And I mean, that's expected though, because you're planning something out. And anytime you're trying to think about what activities you should do and what the future is going to hold, there's risk there, because the future is unknown. You haven't done this yet. You haven't experienced it. Therefore, there's going to be risk of things going differently than you expect. So based on the people that you have in the room for this specific change, what kind of change we're talking about? Are we talking about improving a process, or are we talking about improving the technology? Maybe both. So I want to use tools and techniques that have worked for the combination of the kind of people I have in the room and the kind of challenge we're trying to address. And so if I'm working on some insurance claim stuff and I've got underwriters and accountants in the room, there's going to be certain collaborative games I probably don't want to use. If I'm trying to improve a process and make it a lot more efficient, I'm probably going to use some value stream mapping with lean efforts and Six Sigma. If I'm trying to modify software, I'm probably going to do, and it's a small change, I'm probably just going to do some user stories with acceptance. If I'm trying to build a whole new function in the system and it's going to involve a new screen or two, I'm probably going to want to do use cases. So based on the goals of the change, you're going to want to coordinate your activities that you need to do with others. You're going to want to assess the risk and plan to mitigate it based on what you're trying to accomplish with that change. And based on the change and the people involved, you're going to want to determine what are the best tools and techniques to give me the highest success in ensuring that I have defined those requirements well. And if your organization expects certain types of work product or certain types of metrics, then you want to make sure that you're taking that into consideration when you're planning this out so that it enables those expectations to be met. Okay. The BA approach. If you have an organization that's resistant to everything but a specific approach, like maybe all they do is Scrum, that's it. Okay, well, if you're trying to get them to do something that's more predictive, you're probably gonna have a challenge, right? So it's important that whatever approach you deem appropriate for the change that you're addressing, that the stakeholders involved accept it. If they can't accept your approach, they're not going to accept much else from you that comes from that approach. So you want to ensure that if you want to do adaptive, which is not necessarily agile, and there's an agile extension to the BABOK, and the way they describe adaptive does not match most agile shops I've been in. It's more of a blend of agile and waterfall. You've got iterative, which is a lot more like agile. So I'm not suggesting either waterfall or agile in any of my conversations with you. But if you want to lean a little more towards the predictive because this challenge in front of you has a lot of risk, but your environment is very not predictive, they're fly by the seat of their pants and they just need to get change done, you might have a problem getting people to agree with your approach. And if they don't agree with your approach and you're trying to get information out of them so you can define good change, you might not be very successful. Everything can be informal, not just this. If you've got if you've got a challenge that's been brought to you and the solution is pretty quick and easy, this can be really informal. It can just be a couple of conversations standing at the water cooler and you're done. I mean, it's possible. Or you can have a really big challenge in front of you and it's more involved and requires more patience from everyone. It really depends on the situation. Now, if you're making a recommendation and people aren't agreeing with you, then it's important that we record and resolve those issues. If you're in an environment that does not tolerate anything but a specific thing, it's still important that you document the risks. If you see risks with being purely iterative, which is what Agile is, if you don't raise the flag about those possible challenges, and if you don't present the risks that are associated with that for this specific change, and things mess up later, who usually is left holding the bag if the need isn't met effectively?
Laura, if I got the approach, input plan the approach.
I'm sorry, say that one more time, please.
If accept BA approach, an input of plan the approach.
Hold on just a second. I don't want to tell you incorrectly. No, it's just the needs.
Okay, thank you.
Accepting the BA approach is just an activity that needs to occur. It's a step in the process. So you have evaluated the change that you've been asked to help to address, and you're thinking through it and you're planning it out, and now you've presented it to someone. They need to accept it. Your preference of approaching a challenge based on, the complexity, criticality, and the resources involved. You might say, hey, I know that we're this kind of an organization and we typically do change this way, but I really recommend we approach this differently because of this. And if they don't want to accept that, then that's fine. You can do whatever their organizational performance standards require, but you've documented the risks. If you don't do that up front, and if you just automatically do, if you're the business analyst and it's your responsibility to define requirements and help the organization get that need met, and you don't, and you have concerns about approaching it too quickly or just going down the iterative road, and something goes wrong when, further down the path, who often is seen as the core, the primary source of that failure? Is it the developer?
The VA.
Yeah. Well, you defined the requirements. I tried to tell you, sorry, that we needed to take a minute and do these other steps. So it's important that you do this piece right here. Right here. This. So whatever approach is defined for a change that you're expected to execute, if there are risks associated with it, it's important that you document those risks. Here's what happens when you put those risks in writing and it's not just in a conversation. People don't like owning risk. If you see a challenge with a specific approach, whether it could be that they want to do it predictive and you're like, we don't have time because this other bad thing could happen. No, but this is I'm not comfortable. I'm not comfortable putting that in place until you do these things. Okay, well, that's fine. We can take the time to do that. Here's the risk you accept. Right? As soon as you put that risk on their side of the fence, they'll go, wait a minute, so what do I have to do to avoid having to accept that risk? They won't word it that way. Well, and then you're like, well, I made the recommendation that we do this other, right? So risks, plan it out, understand the risk of the approach you're taking, communicate that to others. If they can't accept it, if they don't like the idea, find out what they will like, record, document the issues that were raised, and do your best to resolve those before you go much further. And that is it for that task. Any questions? I appreciate it when you jump in, by the way, and ask questions in the middle too. So you don't have to wait for me to hit this slide and pause. You can just interrupt. Okay, so this is that slide I was telling you about. This is very, very similar to
just another question
this.
From the chat.
Yes. Hold on one second. I can't see the chat with the way that works. Here we go. Approach equals perspective. I would be careful about that because there are 4 or 5. There might be 5 perspectives in the BABOK. Approach is not a perspective. Approach is how I'm going to tackle something. How am I going to do this business analysis? I can either do it predictive, which is planning everything up front and crossing all of my T's and dotting all of my I's, or adaptive, which is where I'm going to be strategic about it and I'm going to do my strategy analysis up front, but my work that I'm going to do is going to be a learning process, and I'm going to do smaller amounts of implementation so I can learn. Waterfall and Agile are 2 different approaches. Would you say Scrum is a subset of Agile or Waterfall Agile? And be careful about using Waterfall and Agile in your mind as the approaches. Those are not approaches in BABOK. It's predictive and adaptive, so just keep that in mind. And you will not be tested on anything like Scrum or anything like that. That's, I don't even know if, okay, so they do mention a little bit of Agile in here. And it's just, oh no, never mind. That's the Agile perspective. So the word Scrum is not anywhere in the area of the BABOK you will be tested on. So and the word Agile shows up here and there, but it's not, yeah, it's actually not in the word Agile. When you look in planning and monitoring, the word Agile doesn't show up. It's predictive and adaptive, so just keep that in mind, okay? I don't, Vidi Patel, I'm not an Agile aficionado. Every Agile shop I've ever been in has been hard for me to do what I'm supposed to do, and there's all kinds of challenge. Usually when I go into, I have thoughts on Agile. You can find some stuff out there about how I feel about Agile, but I'm not a fan of waterfall either. I'm like that Goldilocks person where when we were waterfall, there were all kinds of problems with that. So as humans, we often try to do the exact opposite of what's hurting. So then we went Agile, which was too far the other way. I'm like, there's a happy middle place of reason, and I should be able to adjust what I'm expected to do based on the specific situation I'm dealing with. Sometimes it's a little more predictive. Sometimes it's a little more adaptive. It just really depends. I know that there are, there are so many variations of Agile because they're still trying to get it right. So I don't have an answer for that. Any other questions before we move on? So one last thought. This is the same as this, except you don't have, except this is not here. This is highly text driven. It's a little harder for your brain to absorb and memorize because pictures and colors engage your brain differently. And I'm just talking, scientific structure wise. But what I do love about this summary slide is the fact that it dumps what techniques are involved in this knowledge area, in this task. But so when you're studying, I would study this and this from a memorization perspective. Yes, Caleb, I will do that. You will hear me talk about it off and on throughout training. Okay. We are at a 50-minute mark where I typically like giving you about a 10-minute break. Let's see. It is the 57-minute mark. Give me just 1 second. I'm trying to wrap my head around what we're looking at for the rest. Okay, those aren't that bad. One moment, please. I'm sorry. Okay, those aren't that bad. Okay, I'm going to give you a small break. It is the 57-minute mark. So it's 3 minutes before the hour. By the time I get done talking to you, it's going to be 2 minutes before the hour. Let's come back at the 10-minute mark, please. So you got about 12 minutes of a break, and I will pause this.